Okay, so we are live. Hi.
Yay. Hi.
Good morning again, Kumitaa. You want to tell us a little bit about where you are doing this call from?
Sure. All right. So I work in this really amazing part of Penang. I know most of you are from Selangor, but Penang's a really beautiful state. I work in the University of Science Malaysia. My place is called the Advanced Medical and Dental Institute. So we actually get to see this really, really high-tech stuff. Usually, I think a lot of us here are working on stuff which is like the first in Malaysia. So it's very cool being here.
Okay. So yeah, I'm so excited to be able to bring you here today to do the talk for us. We're still a little bit early, so we are going to start on time at 10 o'clock.
All right.
Right now, yeah, I see that there are 4 people who are ready for their lesson. Who are here.
Hi, morning, everyone.
Yeah, so I'm gonna just kind of give everyone a heads up how this is going to be. I'm just going to be here for now, and after that, when Kumitaa is ready to start, I will let Kumitaa take over, and she's going to share her life working as a scientist, and then she's going to talk about her work around the COVID testing and share her knowledge around the vaccine that is coming to Malaysia very soon. If you have any question, you see the chat box on your right. So you should just put your questions there. Any comments, just put your comments there. If you have anything you don't understand at all, just ask. I will be taking down all the questions at the end as well, and then we will get that. We will ask Kumitaa to answer your questions. So don't be shy. Just share your questions and anything you want to ask, because you're not going to be able to reach Kumitaa every day. So please take this opportunity and ask the questions that you want. Okay. Okay. So untuk murid-murid yang sudah join kita hari ini, so kalau ada apa-apa soalan, ada apa-apa yang tak faham, ada apa-apa yang nak komen, guna saja di chat box kat sini dan tanya Dr. Kumitaa. Okay. So we have 1 hour until 11 o'clock. So anything that you want to ask, go ahead and ask. Okay. Let's see what's happening there. We still have 3 people here. Okay. All right. Okay. So Kumitaa, do you always work on Saturday?
I actually do, yeah, because I think we always hear people working Mondays to Fridays, 8 to 5. But I think one thing that I enjoy is actually being a scientist is actually really flexible. For now, we're actually super busy because I'm involved in COVID work. So a lot of times, because we do COVID testing, we really want to get the results out as quickly as possible because people are really worried about it. Am I positive? Am I not positive? So we do end up working most weekends. At least that's how it's been for the past year. So yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of COVID cases, so I can imagine it must be very busy.
Yes.
So thank you for making time. Okay, so I think that like I said, any questions, post on the chat box. Any comments? If you are here and you're joining us, you just join us. Say hi to us so we know who you are.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Hi to everyone. Good morning. Okay.
Good morning, everyone.
Yeah. So don't forget to just put your questions there, put your comments there, anything that you want to share. If Dr. Kumitaa is talking too fast or she's saying something you don't understand, please just ask straight away. Sorry, what is that? Can you repeat that? So Dr. Kumitaa will be able to see that, and I will be able to answer you as well. Okay, so without any further ado, I am going to let Dr. Kumitaa start. Let me just put this up. Okay, let me add to the stream. Sorry. Yeah, there we go. Okay, all right. So Kumitaa, without any further ado, please take it away.
All right, thank you, May. Hi, good morning, everyone. So excited to be here today. I've heard so much about all of you. So, hopefully you'll enjoy this little talk about, kind of what it means to be a scientist, what's my daily life like, and, hearing just a little bit about COVID and vaccines, which is something that everyone is so worried about these days. Next slide, please. All right, so I'll be going over 5 main topics. The first one is kind of how did I get here? What's the journey? I think that's something that everyone always wants to know. Did I always want to be a scientist from, when I was like 8 years old? And then we'll move on a little bit to COVID. So, what do people mean when they talk about vaccines? What's in it? Does it really work? Is it really good? Should I take it? Should I not? I'll be going over all those things in my talk today. As May pointed out earlier, if you do have any questions, please feel free to type it out in the comment box. I always love questions. There's no such thing as a dumb question. If you don't understand any word, you want me to explain something a bit more, just type it out. Next slide, please. All right, so what do I do as a scientist? Kind of how did I get here? Next slide, please. Right. So when I was your age, there were 2 things that I really liked. The first one was I really liked Disney cartoons. I really liked all the Disney movies, and I really, really wanted to go to Disneyland. And I found out that Disneyland was in California, in the US. So that was the first thing I liked. And then the second thing I liked was I liked all these science experiments. I thought it was really cool that, kind of just like reading about it or seeing it on TV, you could just mix 2 different things together and end up with something completely different. And I thought that was really cool. It was like a magic trick almost. And then I thought about it a bit more, and I thought, how can I put my 2 loves together, Disneyland or Disney cartoons and science? And I thought, well, what if I tried to become a scientist and, do it in California, in the US? But I realized to actually go study in a different country, you needed quite a bit of money, and my parents didn't have a lot of money. But then I found out that if you studied really, really hard, you could actually get scholarships. And so that's what I did. And, by the time I turned 18, I actually ended up getting a scholarship to go to California to be a scientist or to study science. So the very first photo at the top, that kind of blue, very beautiful blue building with green grass outside, that was actually my university back when I was 18 years old. I really loved my college or my university experience a lot. There was so much I could do, if I wanted to learn about music or art or dancing. I could do everything. It was free. As long as you wanted to learn, you could do it. So I ended up staying there for 10 years. So I did my degree and then moved on to do a master's, and then eventually ended up with a PhD. And then by the time I got my PhD, I thought, you know what? I kind of miss home. Let me try being a scientist in Malaysia. So then I ended up coming back to Malaysia after 10 years. So I've been back since then. And I don't know how many people here want to be a scientist. Is there anyone here who have, thought of being a scientist? You can type it out in the chat box. I would love to see if anyone has been interested. I see, a smiley face from me. So if you don't know what a scientist's life is like, and that's why you don't know if you want to be a scientist or not, let me tell you all about it. So it's actually pretty cool what we do on a daily basis. We do get to teach people. It's not just in class. Sometimes we get to give talks to the public. We get to help out with different sorts of people. So if you see the second photo in the diagram, second on the left, the one where I'm wearing this like red baju kurung, that was us being able to help out patients in the hospital. We get to, sometimes it's quite glamorous. So we sometimes end up on the radio and the TV, so it's quite nice. You feel a little famous. So that's kind of the third photo on the left at the bottom. We also get to travel quite a bit, actually. So we get to give talks in different countries. We get to train and do science in different countries. So I actually got to go to the very famous Oxford University. So that's the photo on the top right, the one with the very beautiful pink flowers. So that's Oxford. And then, and of course, we get to do amazing research, which I love. So the photo at the very bottom, that's actually me in the COVID lab, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in my next slide. Next slide, please. All right. So a large part of what scientists do is research. And to me, it's really, really fun because there's no day is ever the same. You get to try a bunch of different things. It's a lot like if you really like ice cream, and imagine if you can kind of mix 10 different ice cream flavors together to see kind of what you get. And maybe today you think I want to add chocolate and vanilla. Tomorrow you say you want to add, strawberry and vanilla, and just to kind of see what you get. That's kind of what a scientist or research is like to me. So I work mostly with this thing called a DNA. Has anyone here heard of DNA before? Okay, it's okay if you have, or if you haven't. So DNA is what we call as building blocks. It's a lot like if you are trying to you're trying to build a Lego house. So each of that kind of tiny Lego pieces. So that's kind of what DNA is. We call them building blocks. So depending on how you put them together, you end up with something very different. But DNA is what gives you your cells, and it's also what enables you to look different from your brother or your sister, your mom or your dad. So that's kind of what DNA is. We call it the genetic material. And what I do specifically is thanks for pointing at the DNA. So but what I also do specifically, hi Basin, but what I do specifically is I do genetic modification or genome editing. So if any of you have heard about like designer babies, being able to make a baby look, very different, or even if you yourself, if you think, I think my brown eyes or my black eyes is kind of boring, I want blue eyes. So you can actually do that with genome editing. So that's what I do. You can use it to change physical traits. So, your eyes, your nose, your mouth, the color of your hair. But we also use it mostly to help make diseases better. So to prevent diseases, kind of as a gene therapy, a treatment towards diseases. Specifically, I work on viruses. So I've been doing that for a very, very long time now, almost 20 years now. And in general, I always try to inhibit or prevent diseases. So that's kind of how I ended up doing COVID work as well since early last year. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. All right, so just a little bit about, what it's been like to work on COVID. We always hear, it always seems so scary, right? So the first photo is actually the kind of really colorful photo. That's actually what COVID looks like. So COVID, which stands for coronavirus. Corona actually means crown, like the crown that you put on your head. So that's why you kind of see that spikes. So it's quite interesting because it sounds very, very regal, like a king, like a queen. So that's actually what coronavirus is. And we've studied it quite a bit, and a huge part of what I do from then even till today is COVID testing. And someone else said hi. And what I do, so when you do COVID testing, it looks a lot like the second photo on the right. We actually have to wear, we call that personal protective equipment. So you have to wear your mask, you have to wear a face shield, you have to wear like a head covering, you have to wear 3-4 different layers of clothes. So it actually takes about 30 minutes just to put it on. And that's just to make sure we really protect ourselves. And, after, sampling or taking the sample from someone else, we make sure we don't accidentally pass COVID on to someone else. So kind of looking at the second photo at the top, that's kind of how COVID testing is usually done when we're working with patients. If you look at the first photo on the left, that one. So that's actually what it looks like in the COVID lab. So once we take samples, or we take, your saliva or something, what we do is it goes through a really long process. It takes about 6 hours or so to work with it. And then we finally end up putting it in this machine that you see down there. And that is what eventually tells you whether someone is COVID positive or not. So we've been doing that for a long time now. And the good thing is that now a lot of scientists have found out that there are possible vaccines. And that's what we're going to spend most of today talking about. So again, what are vaccines? How does it work? How does it protect us against this very scary virus? Next slide, please. All right, so before I go on further, does anyone have any questions? Kind of just a little bit about what does it mean to be a scientist? Is there anything you want to hear a little bit more about? Any questions about even like COVID testing or just like COVID as a whole? I'll take a couple of seconds to let you think about it, digest. Everyone, is it a bit too early in the morning, or is everyone very shy? Okay, I'm just gonna continue, but again, if you have any questions, do feel free to type it out at any time. All right, so next we'll move on to how do vaccines work? We hear so much about it every day now, but yeah, how does it work? Next slide. Yeah, feel free to ask questions, please. Next slide, please. All right, so I think all of us would probably agree that COVID has really changed our lives so drastically, right? Even if I asked all of you right now, kind of thinking back to what your life was in 2019 to now, how do you think your life has changed? Do you get to see your friends as often? Do you miss being able to go to class? Do you kind of just miss going out into the playground? But before I go into that, I have a very interesting question. So the question is, how did I get into the COVID team? Sorry. So yeah, I think that's something that people always want to know, right? Can anyone get into the team? Oh, someone says miss going to class and seeing everyone. Yeah, I kind of miss seeing everyone too. So how I got into the COVID team is because when they were assembling the team, because this is a virus that is really, really quite scary, they did make sure that anyone who's working on it has been trained in viruses for a long time. So I actually trained in a lot of different places. So I know how to kind of grow the virus up. I know how to make sure I can tell whether the virus is there or not. And mostly what's really important is, I also know how to protect myself against the virus. So that's why, I think the whole team, at least here in my university, I think there's about 20 of us who's on the team who's involved in testing. So it's actually really cool, and you feel that you're really kind of helping the country a lot. Kind of waking up every day and knowing that you can just tell someone you're okay. It's something that is very satisfying. I'm going to take the next question. So the next question is there a scientist job in Malaysia? Great. I'm so excited to see that hopefully someone is already thinking about being a scientist. Yes, there actually are plenty of scientist jobs in Malaysia. So I work as a scientist in a university. I work in University Science Malaysia in Penang. I know most of you are based in Selangor, so you could work in universities like University Malaya, which is in Petaling Jaya. You could work in University Kebangsaan Malaysia, which is in Kajang, Bani. And that's just like the public or the government universities. But you can also work in private universities. So like Taylor's or Sunway, you could also work as a scientist there. There are also a lot of private companies. So those private companies, usually they have a branch or they are from a different country. So, maybe the headquarters, or the main office is in the US or UK, but then they have like an office here. So there's actually a lot. There's so many. So kind of just depending on what type of work you want to do. There's so many places. You want to grow, you want to be a scientist. Yes, May. That would be great. And you can also work with the government as well. So a lot of the work that we see today related to COVID is actually through the government. So they do spend a lot of time kind of looking at, how has COVID, the virus, how has it changed over time? Does that mean, you have to come up with a different vaccine? So there's actually really so much that you can do. Even if you like just working a bit more with people, then you can do something like COVID testing, where you're kind of just dealing more with people as opposed to working in the lab. No, you don't actually. So if you did a degree and you wanted to be a scientist, or even if you did like a diploma, kind of after your Form 5, if you took another 1 or 2 years, you can actually be a scientist. Of course, the type of work you do would be a bit different. So if you did like a diploma and you become a scientist, maybe the type of work you do would be a bit easier, a bit safer to work with. If you study up to a PhD, you get to work, to me, on a lot of really the cool stuff, just because you've trained a lot longer. But yeah, hopefully all of you are thinking about being a scientist a little bit more after today. All right. Hi to Renam. All right. So kind of going back to the slides, when will life go back to normal? Yeah, like I said, I think everyone kind of misses knowing that they can see their friends whenever they want. So in order for us to go back to that sort of life, we do have to make sure that we are well protected, right? Because right now, if you think about it, you kind of hear, if you go out, you can't shake hands with someone. But if you have vaccines, if you do take vaccines, or if you have this thing called the herd immunity, I'll talk a bit more about it a bit later, then we can get rid of the virus. We can make sure that everyone is safe, and we can go back to normal, hopefully in a couple of months. Next slide, please. All right. So when talking about vaccines, kind of before going into that, I think something that is interesting to know is actually our body itself is pretty strong. If I have to talk about, kind of how our body fights off viruses, if you think about it, before this, when you have a fever, for example, not everyone likes to see a doctor. Some people will just say, all right, I'm just going to lie here in my room. My mom will make me feel better. Or, some people will say, my mom says just eat vitamin C. So actually your body itself does have a very good kind of protection against a lot of viruses. So how it works is, imagine if your body is like a castle, and your natural protection are like mini soldiers, and your mini soldiers are always on the lookout for the bad guys. So the bad guys are like viruses or bacteria or something that is quite harmful to us. And so what your soldiers, what your natural immunity, your natural protection has to do is, they have to be able to recognize which is the bad guy and which is the good guy. You don't want your soldiers to attack the good guys, so those are the good cells, right? So you don't want that to happen. You want them to be able to say, okay, anyone with a red coat, that's the bad guy. So if we see a red coat, we attack them a certain way. If we see someone else with a blue coat, it's a different type of bad guy. We attack them in a certain way. So that's kind of how the body's natural response works. So again, your cells, your body is like a castle, and the mini soldiers, your mini protective elements in your body, that's kind of your natural response. And then again, the bad guys are like the virus. Sorry, next slide, please. Right. So how vaccines work is actually based on, kind of what I mentioned in the slide before that, like soldiers. But in order for vaccines to work, it has to recognize that, which is the bad guy that we're talking about. And it also has to be able to recognize the bad guys quicker and quicker. So it's kind of like, if you notice, say the first time you notice this like guy in red coat, say it takes you 1 month to actually respond and fight them off. Imagine if you have a lot of all these like red coats, a lot of these like viruses just keep on attacking you, and you take 1 month to respond each time. That's a bit slow. So you want your soldiers to kind of be prepared, and even once they see the red coat next time, maybe it takes them only like 1 minute to respond. So that's kind of what we call antibody, that kind of quicker response. And vaccines are made so that they recognize that red code and they can respond faster and they can protect you faster against any disease. So it's kind of saying that you are training your soldiers to respond quickly to protect you against a disease. So that's kind of what a vaccine is like. Next slide, please. Oops, the slide before, please. Okay, so before I go into what is herd immunity, any questions so far on how your body naturally responds, or what is an antibody, or what are vaccines so far? No? Okay, I'll move on then. All right, so whenever people talk about vaccines, the whole point of vaccine is to give you herd immunity. If any of you like animals, especially, you would think herd refers to a group of cows, like that group of very cute cows in the photo there. But actually, what herd immunity means is you try to protect as many people as possible, usually through vaccines, to make sure that the remaining people who are not given the vaccines are protected. So in simple terms, what this means is, say in your classroom you have 20 of you, but only 15 of you took the vaccines and the other 5 didn't. So imagine now you suddenly have the bad guys, the viruses, coming into the room, and they randomly pick people to infect. But 15 of you are already protected. 15 of you already got the vaccine. So can the virus infect many people? The answer is no, right? Probably the first person it sees has already been vaccinated, already protected. It can't infect that person. It moves on to the next person. That person is also already vaccinated, already protected. So it also can't infect that person. So eventually, even though there are that 5 people who are not vaccinated, who have not taken the vaccine, they're actually quite safe. So that's the concept of herd immunity. Now imagine that instead of 15 people who were vaccinated, only 2 people got the vaccine. So the virus enters the room again. It tries to attack the first person, and probably the first person wasn't vaccinated. So that person can get infected. That person can then transfer. That person can, infect someone else. That person can then infect someone else. So herd immunity is also kind of related to how many people in a group were actually vaccinated to make sure that the entire group is safe. Next slide, please. Oops, slide before, please. Okay, so herd immunity is important because if I asked you now, if the vaccine were available for all of you now, how many of you would take it? Maybe you can type out in the chat box below how many of you would take the vaccine. Me, okay, good. I see one yes. Would everyone want to get the vaccine like as soon as possible? I love you. Yes, I love you too. Anyone else? I saw there were a couple of people who commented earlier. What about Renam or Sim or Sarah? Would all of you take the vaccines? Okay, thinking about it. Me, yes, me. I see a couple of people. Well, most people say yes. That's good. So that hopefully most of you will say yes, and hopefully not only you but the people as well would all say yes to the vaccine, because there are some people who actually can't take the vaccines. For example, people with a very weak immune system. So immune system is, that soldiers that we talked about earlier. Those people actually can't take the vaccines. In general, those are people who are a lot older. But in this case, actually, with COVID vaccines, they do work in older people, pregnant women, some people who can't take the vaccines, people with allergies. So I don't know if any of you here, everyone says yes, cool. I don't know if any of you here have allergies, but if you have pretty bad allergies, you actually can't take the vaccine as well. So for the rest of you who are able to take it, then by you taking it, you're actually protecting everyone else as well. Me, so lots of people, cool. So this is the concept of herd immunity. The more people who get vaccinated, the more people who get protected, you actually end up saving the people around you as well, which is a really nice thing to do. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so before I go into how vaccines are developed, any questions so far? Any questions about the immune response or herd immunity? No? Okay, so we'll move on to how our vaccines developed then. Okay. So whenever we hear the word vaccine itself, it sounds something very complex, right? You don't really know what's in it. You read a lot about it, but you don't know what's in it. And it's actually made out of a lot of different parts. So the virus, okay, let me answer this question. So the virus gets weaker in herd immunity. Okay, so this is a very good question. So the question is, by everyone being protected, does it mean that the virus gets weaker? So the virus actually doesn't get weaker per se, but what ends up happening is because it cannot, in order for the virus to survive, the virus is a lot like humans in a way. So in order for it to survive, it just wants to keep having families almost, it wants from one, it wants to make 10 of its family members, and then from 10, it wants to make 100 of its family members and so on. But in order for it to kind of grow larger and make kind of larger families, it needs to be able to infect people. So if you can't infect people, so remember, if you're vaccinated, the virus can't infect you, then there's no way the virus can happily continue making its family, because it'll try attacking one person, that person is protected. It'll move on to the second person, that's also protected. So what ends up happening is the virus will actually just eventually die off because of that, because there's just kind of no one left to infect. So that is actually our best way of fighting the virus, just making sure everyone's protected so the virus will die off. That is actually a very good question. Thank you, Sarah. All right. So again, what's kind of in the vaccine? How does it actually make sure we are protected? So the number one ingredient is, we call it an antigen. And an antigen is actually a small part of the virus, which enables your body to kind of just like quickly prepare itself so that when it sees the actual virus, it's already kind of prepared. It already knows this is the bad guy. So again, the antigen is actually usually a part of the virus. Usually it is the code of the virus, kind of what I said earlier, that red code. It usually is the code of the virus because it's easiest to see, right? You just by looking at what someone is wearing, we know, okay, this is probably that person. It's kind of like our friends, right? If we know that someone has a long ponytail, whenever we see a long ponytail, we'll automatically think of our friend. So it's kind of like that. So in this case, we usually use the coat of the virus, the outer layer of the virus. So that's what an antigen is. And then we also have a lot of other ingredients. It's a lot like cooking, I guess. A lot of other ingredients. So let me take this question really quick, and then I'll get back to what are the other ingredients in a vaccine. So the question is, how long can the virus survive? Okay, so this is a very interesting question. In the body of a person, so if by some reason you do know of someone who actually gets infected, the virus can last for anywhere from as little as 10 days, depending on how strong your soldiers are, to even some people a couple of months actually. So it can be quite scary because at the moment we don't really know whose soldiers are stronger and whose soldiers are weaker. So, if you end up, being infected and you end up being sick for like, a couple of months, that's quite sad because can you imagine kind of being in a hospital for that long? But that's in the body of a human. Viruses actually do need, again, humans to survive. But if it's on the surface, so if you remember, something that we're always told is, wear a mask, wash our hands, and that's because they can actually live on surfaces for a while as well. So, for example, if you're not wearing a mask, say you're infected and you sneeze on the table, and then someone else comes and touches the table and then touches their eyes, they actually can get infected that way. And they can last on different surfaces. So, whether it's wood or metal or plastic, for again, anywhere from a couple of hours to a few days. You're welcome. The virus actually doesn't like hot, like really, really hot temperatures. It actually doesn't do well. Probably very similar to a lot of us, right? You think, we don't really like being under the sun for too long. So the virus is kind of similar too. So if the temperature is too hot, it actually does die off. So that's something that the virus doesn't like. And the other thing that the virus doesn't like is high percentages of bleach. I don't know if many of you know what bleach is, but it's something that's usually found in a lot of cleaners like detergents at home. And it also doesn't like high percentages of alcohol. So that's why if any of you have been using like hand sanitizers, that's also why hand sanitizers have actually a very, very high percentage of alcohol in it, because alcohol actually kills the virus. So again, viruses don't like high temperatures, so really hot temperatures. They don't like bleach and they don't like alcohol. So yes, that's why it's so important to always make sure you sanitize and wash your hands. Good question, mustard seed. Thank you. All right, so kind of going back to what's in a vaccine. So it's a little bit different. It doesn't have like bleach or alcohol in it. It contains different ingredients. So again, the first one is it contains antigens, so a part of the virus. But because it's only a part of the virus, it's not dangerous to us. It's just so to tell our soldiers, hey, this is what you should be looking out for. The second thing that it has is preservatives. So we don't want our viruses to be contaminated. So contaminated means something like, okay, imagine if you're drinking your favorite drink, maybe it's hot Milo, that's my favorite drink, and I kind of leave it outside on the table for a couple of hours. I forget about it. I go out and play with my friends and come back, the next day. Is it okay to drink? Probably not. Trump asked us to drink bleach. Now I know, yes, mustard seed. That was the justification behind why Trump asked us to drink bleach. But no, don't do that. But yeah, so kind of going back to preservatives. So preservatives is to make sure that the vaccine is not spoiled. You can use it and it is safe to humans. The next thing that's in it is called stabilizers. So it's kind of like stabilizers are meant to make sure that your vaccine doesn't stick to the vial, the container that it's in. And that's just, kind of again using Milo as an example. Imagine if you're trying to drink your Milo, but it's all kind of just stuck to the walls of your cup. You can't really drink it, right? So, instead of getting like one whole glass of Milo, you end up with just a little bit. That's kind of sad. So that's what stabilizers are. There's also this thing called surfactants. And surfactants is to prevent clumping. So again, kind of using like Milo. Imagine if you're trying to drink your Milo and there's just like clumps of Milo and clumps of like milk or clumps of sugar. It's not so good, right? So you want to make sure everything is blended properly. So that's what a surfactant is. And then there's also, sorry, but yeah, and then we also have, I think, the person controlling the slides eager to move on. And then we also have, a couple of other components. Oh, no worries at all. And then we have a couple of other components, and it's all that actually makes the vaccine a vaccine. All right, next slide, please. All right, before I move on, any questions so far? No? Okay, so I'll move on to what happens after you've actually made your vaccine. That's what researchers do, right? They put all those components together, they found what they think is the best vaccine. So, kind of what do you do next? How do you make sure that it's really safe? So, we call this the clinical phase. It's when you actually test your vaccine out in a group of people over a certain period of time. And the first thing you test for is it safe or not? So you designed your vaccine so that it's supposed to protect people. Can you make sure that other than protecting people, it doesn't give you any other unexpected effects? So you don't want it to protect people, but you find out that if anyone who takes it, then they end up with something really terrible. So that's usually what the first phase is, to check for safety. The second phase is it uses, or they test it on a bit more people. Um, and it looks into a little bit more of safety as well, but a more thorough aspect of safety. So in the first part, maybe it would just be, do you have anything external when you take the vaccine? Do you get any rashes? You don't. Okay, that's great. The second one may be, do you see anything else? Do you, feel like throwing up? Do you get a fever? And usually that's what they look at in the second phase. And because they test it out in a larger group of people, they're actually able to see those type of effects. The third phase is the one which is the most important one. It is, does it work or not? So you say that you want to protect someone against COVID in this case, right? So if the person actually really is exposed to COVID, are they okay? If they end up getting COVID, then obviously the vaccine doesn't work. So that's what the third phase is. There's actually a lot of different vaccines that have been developed, but the ones that are currently approved are there are three vaccines that are currently approved. I'll talk a little bit more about all those different vaccine candidates in one of my later slides. All right, next slide, please. Right. So this is kind of a typical timeline of how long it takes to actually develop a vaccine. So if you look at the image below, the one with the really cute mouse in it, a typical vaccine clinical trial actually takes about 15 years, from when it's actually developed in the lab. So it's actually a really long time, longer than how old most of you are actually. And that's because they just want to make sure it's really, really safe. So, first they test it out in animals. Do they see what they expect to see in animals? And then again, phase one, which tests for safety, they test in a really small group of people, usually about, less than 100. Then they move on to the next group. So that's about 1,000. And then they move on to the next group where they test whether it works or not. That's, a couple of thousands. And then eventually it goes through, we call it a regulatory process. So you have different people kind of looking at it, making sure that everything is okay. All the ingredients are okay. The dose is okay. It works in like young people and old people and different genders and different ethnicities. And then they actually, then it's up to the companies to actually make sure there's enough vaccines for everyone. So kind of thinking a little bit even for us, what we're going through right now, that means companies have to produce enough vaccines for the entire world. That's so many people. So kind of, how long does it actually take to do all that? So that's why a typical vaccine clinical trial takes about 15 years. Okay, I got a question. Sorry, you can answer this later, but all those elements of the vaccines, are they common for different vaccines? Okay, I think I'll answer mustard seeds question first. And then I got another question from Sarah: how many thousands tested the new vaccines? And then there's so many. Okay, I'll try and answer. I'll answer mustard seeds first question first. I'll answer Sarah's question when I explain about how the clinical trials was done for COVID, and then I'll answer mustard seeds' second question in my next slide. So for the first question is, when I listed all the ingredients earlier, is that common in all vaccines? Yes. So that's actually the pretty general components of every single vaccine. Some of you may have heard of the name Pfizer, some of you may have heard of AstraZeneca, some of you may have heard of Moderna or Johnson & Johnson. But in general, those components are all pretty regular. You do always want to make sure, regardless of what vaccine you're dealing with, that it's in a stable condition. You don't want to get something in liquid form and then, one day later it turns into something else, like solid form. So that's not good. You do always kind of want it to be stable, because a lot of times you are transporting this vaccine, which, our next speaker will talk about it in, her talk, and she's here today. You do kind of want to make sure that regardless of how you're transporting it, it always remains, just as safe and just as effective. So hopefully that answers your question, Mustard Seed. And then for Sarah's question, I'll answer it after explaining how the timeline of COVID vaccines worked. So we heard that for typical trials, it takes about 15 years, but with COVID, it actually only took about a year to come out with the vaccine. And it's a bit different because you actually had the entire world working on it. So Mustard Seed kind of pointed out, we had people from Russia working on it, from China, from India, the US and UK, of course, were huge groups that all pushed for the development of vaccines. And what was interesting was actually this was one of the largest clinical trials ever done in the history of the world, actually. So remember how I said in phase 1, it's usually about 100 people, phase 2 is maybe about 1,000, phase 3, it's about, a couple more thousands. But in the COVID vaccine trials, for each of the different companies, they tested it in close to 50,000 people, 50. So that's a lot of people, and they actually tested it in different countries all around the world at the exact same time. So it's not just kind of like, you testing it out with your classmates, in Malaysia or in Selangor. This was literally, having kind of 20 different testing sites. And that way, when I spoke a little bit earlier about how, sometimes they were looking for side effects, they actually got to see, what were the side effects because of all these different conditions and types of people they were testing it in. So it was actually really, really impressive, just the sheer number of people that they worked with. So yeah, wow is actually a really good response. Pretty amazing, I agree. So that's why, I think, when people ask me, well, with COVID, you're looking at 1 year as opposed to 15 years. Isn't that a lot shorter? Yes, it is a lot shorter, but actually a lot more work was actually done into it because it is so important. A lot more people were involved in it. A lot more testing was actually done on it as well, to make sure that it's really safe and that it could actually be distributed in 1 year. So I would say that all of you are actually living in this very amazing historical moment, because none other times for no other diseases has this ever been done. So one day when you're older, you can tell, everyone around you that you lived through this pretty amazing moment. All right, next slide, please. All right, sorry. So another thing that was pretty good is usually when you talk about vaccines against diseases, okay, I'll get to Paysin's question in a bit, but let me quickly talk about kind of the general why it was also so quick. So usually when you talk about previous diseases in the past, whether it's like influenza or measles or something, usually you only have people kind of working on 2-3 different vaccines. But with COVID, there were actually 66 different programs, and this was just based at that particular time when I got the data. There's actually a lot more now. Just for vaccines now, there are actually about 64 different vaccines that are being developed. So that's really a lot. And it's not just vaccines. There's also antibodies. So antibodies are kind of like the soldiers that I was talking about earlier. So some people actually kind of said, okay, I'm going to go in, take antibodies from people who have already recovered from COVID and see if I can use that as a form of treatment. So there are actually 16 different methods of doing that. And then there's also repurposed drugs. So repurposed drugs, what this means is they look at other viruses kind of in the same family, or which had kind of similar effects, and just to see, okay, if I have this particular drug, I'm just going to use Panadol as an example, and say Panadol worked against this certain virus that was from the same family, can I use Panadol against COVID as well? So they actually had 7 different types of drugs that they were testing against COVID. So kind of just looking at this, again, there are so many different things that people are doing. So it's actually not surprising that we actually did get the vaccine, and we would see a lot more different types of treatment coming up in the next couple of months. I'm going to answer Paysin's question because this is actually a very interesting question. Is the vaccine sufficient for all generations of the virus? So I don't know if any of you have heard or read, but something we've been hearing quite a lot is mutations. And mutations is a lot, to put it in simpler terms, is if you start off with a green Lego block, mutation is what changes it a little bit, just tiny enough, but it may cause, something that looks different or acts differently. So that's kind of like, from a green Lego block, you end up getting a blue Lego block instead of the mutation, or from a red code, you end up with a blue code. So imagine you were training your body to recognize red code. So if the virus suddenly changes to a blue code, can your body still recognize that? So that's what a mutation is. The answer is actually yes. At the moment, they have tested the current COVID vaccines against all the different mutations. So there was the one that came up in Kedah a few months ago. There's one that's from UK that people are quite worried about. There's actually one from South Africa that's the latest one that people are even more worried about. But they've actually found out that the vaccines that have been developed actually all work against all those different mutations and all those different COVID. So yay for science, it does work. But in general, if you're talking about kind of other viruses and other vaccines, we do have other viruses that do mutate or do change very quickly. So one example is influenza. We don't worry about it too much here in Malaysia, but in Western countries like the US and UK, they do worry about it quite a bit. So eventually what ends up happening is they do kind of change the vaccine a little bit so that they have a newer form of the vaccine every 6 months or every 1 year. Usually, even in this case, with all the vaccines that I'll be talking about, few, yes, definitely few. So even with all these vaccines that I'll be talking in detail about in the next few slides, they actually know that they can change it if needed in less than 1 month. So in 4 weeks, they're able to come up with a newer, updated vaccine, and they don't actually have to go through the entire clinical trials because it's actually just changing something that's very small. So no matter what, we'll all be protected. Thank you, Paysin. That was a very, very good question. I have another question. What about the worrying B117? So for those who have not heard of B117, that's the one that is from the UK. So the reason why people are worried about that particular mutation or that particular COVID is because it is said to be able to infect people easier. So if in the past, for every 1 person infected, say you can infect one other person, in this case, it may be 2 or 3 times more. So that seems a bit scary, right? Imagine if you know of one friend who has it, you don't know if you may be infected. And Mustard Seed's question is, Singapore has one. It won't be long before it reaches Malaysia. So Mustard Seed, unfortunately, it already has reached Malaysia. We do have a couple of cases already in Malaysia, and we are trying to keep it so that, it's a bit more controlled. But don't worry, kind of going back to what I answered from Paysin's question earlier, is that the vaccine does protect all of us. But meanwhile, while we're waiting for the vaccines, what all of us can definitely do is always remember to wear our mask, try not to go out often, don't shake hands, make sure your hands are sanitized. And I think that's something that all of us can do to make sure we are protected while waiting for the virus. But thank you, Mustard Seed. That was a good question. All right, next slide, please. All right, so I'm not going to go over this too much because I see I only have like 10 minutes left. But when talking about COVID vaccines specifically, I would say they can be divided into two groups. So for any of you who have heard of Pfizer vaccine, that refers to what I call as a genetic vaccine. So it's related to the genetic blocks that I was talking about earlier. So not DNA, but a slightly different form called RNA. So what it does is it contains a certain part of the virus that would enable your body to recognize it as a potential, troublemaker and make sure you're protected. And then that way, when you actually see the real virus, your soldiers are already kind of ready to attack it. Sorry. So that's kind of what the Pfizer vaccine is all about. We also have viral vector vaccines. So this one is the AstraZeneca Oxford one, for example. And the viral vector vaccines actually use the actual virus, but a weakened form of it. So again, maybe they may use like a larger component of the virus, but they've removed certain parts of it. So again, it's not dangerous. And it does work similar to the genetic vaccine in that your body would recognize it as a potential threat, kind of get all their defense up, their soldiers ready, and then when they see the real virus, it's ready to attack. Between these two, actually, viral vector vaccines are the ones which have been used for a lot of other diseases in the past. And they've actually used this to actually get rid of a lot of diseases like smallpox, for example. So both are actually pretty good. There are differences, and I'll talk about them in the next slide. Next slide, please. All right, so again, just to kind of recap, we have 64 total COVID vaccines out there right now, more coming up soon from different countries, and 20 which are in phase 3, so 20 where they're testing to see whether it does work or not. Next slide, please. All right, so there are a lot of different, one slide back, please. Okay, so there are a lot of different approved COVID vaccines, but the one we hear about are the ones which are listed in the top 3. Yes, thank you, Rina. Wearing a mask all the time is good. Okay, so there are a couple of approved COVID vaccines. So Moderna is one of it. Pfizer is the one that Malaysia has bought a lot of. So this is the one that probably most people will be getting. It was tested in about 50,000 people, and it was found to be almost 95% effective. So really, really effective. And it has to be stored at minus 70 degrees. So we'll talk about the temperature part in a bit. And it also has to be given in 2 doses. And the 2 doses is just to make sure that, your body is extremely protected. Malaysia also did purchase AstraZeneca's one. It was also tested in a lot of people, and it's stored at 4 degrees. Johnson & Johnson, we haven't heard much about it yet, but it should be out in a couple of months as well. Right, next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to take a mini break here and see if anyone has any questions so far about, Moderna or Pfizer or AstraZeneca. Even if you want to know more about like Russia, so Russia's vaccine is called Gamaleya or Sputnik. Or if you want to hear about the vaccines from China, from Sinovac or Sinopharm, I can also talk about it. Otherwise, we can move on to the second last bit. I still have this bit, and then some of the common myth related to vaccines. No? Right. Shall I move on? Okay, so how are vaccines administered? So earlier on, I pointed out that with Pfizer, the one that most of us will probably be getting has to be stored at minus 70. So that's actually really, really cold. Kind of thinking a little bit about it. Does anyone here? So hopefully everyone knows when you talk about if something is frozen, what temperature that's at. So that's usually like 0 degrees. Or, if you walk into an air-conditioned room, what temperature that's at. Or if you talk about your favorite ice cream, what temperature that's stored at. So this is way colder than all of that. So I kind of put up a mini diagram there just to kind of show you what it is. So again, freezing is 0. And this is a lot colder than that. And yes, freezing cold. And then, and what's interesting about it is to actually kind of make sure that the vaccine is stored well in that temperature is that there actually is this kind of like fatty layer that's surrounding it, because it does kind of survive and it is good in different conditions. So the vaccine is actually in this fatty layer called lipid nanoparticles. Okay, I'm going to take a question. Upon taking a vaccine, there is still a time taken before it's effective. Okay, so I'm guessing what mustard seed is asking is, if you take the vaccine today is Saturday, does it mean that tomorrow the vaccine will be effective? That's a good question. So it's not so fast. It's not like one day. It does take a couple of days to a couple of weeks, depending on how good your immune system is. And that's actually also why it's related to 2 doses. So the 2 doses, I'll talk about it in the next slide a bit, but the 2 doses are actually given in a span of 3 weeks apart. So that's to kind of make sure like your first round of soldiers are kind of ready. So at least, if you are exposed to the virus in the first 3 weeks upon taking the vaccine, you do have a certain amount of protection, but you are only fully protected after the second dose. So again, second dose is given about 3 weeks after the first dose. So typically it takes closer to a month, a little bit more than a month before you're fully protected. So again, if any of you are given the vaccine tomorrow, I would still say kind of try to stay home as much as you can, still put on your mask. You still can't go traveling to like your favorite places around the world yet, but it would still take about a week or so. But that's a very good question. Thank you, Mustard Seed. All right, next slide, please. I think we're almost towards the end. All right, so this will be covered by the next speaker, but I just wanted to point out that because it is stored at -70, that's super cold temperature, we do have to store it in glass. And you can kind of think about it a little bit, kind of thinking about how your mom stores food at home. If your mom stored it in a metal box versus a wooden box or a Tupperware or glass, which one is the best? If you store it in plastic and you put it in the freezer, does it survive well? Do you kind of end up with plastic breaking or cracking or something? So typically glass is always the best for something that is this cold. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so almost done. I'll try to wrap up since there's only a couple more minutes left. So this is kind of how is the vaccine administered. So I decided to talk a little bit about, good question. If the vaccine has to be stored in low temperature, how can we as humans use it? Yeah, good question. So that makes sense, right? If you're talking about something that's frozen, are you kind of, I don't know, getting the person, thank you, but fully protected, but how long would we need? Okay, let me answer Sim's question first, and I'll move on to Mustard Seed's question. So yeah, so if you're talking about -70, when you do kind of put it into you, so the vaccines are given by injection. It's actually not too bad. It's in your shoulder area. It feels a little bit like an ant bite. It'll take a couple of seconds, and then you can go out and do the things that you like. But it's actually not frozen. I mean, it's not given to you in frozen form. You actually do have to take it out to thaw it. It's a little bit like if your mom wants to cook chicken at home or fish, your mom actually has to take it out. Some moms would say, all right, I'm just going to leave it in the fridge for a bit. Some people will say, all right, I'm just going to leave it outside on the kitchen counter or something. So you do have to go through that process. If you leave it in the fridge, you have to leave it for a couple of hours, so about 3 hours or so. If you want to leave it outside, then that's room temperature, so of course it takes a bit less time. So that's a very good question. And then after you've left it outside for a bit and it's thawed, so it's not frozen anymore, you actually do have to add something else to it. So in this case, it's usually like a salt or a saline solution, and then that actually makes it up into the actual vaccine that you give to people. So that's a very good question, Sim. Thank you very much. Something else to point out about the vaccine is, which is quite interesting. So each vial actually has to be given to 5 people. So they do have to plan it pretty well. So it's kind of like you and 4 of your friends can go and take it together. Because if not, if they don't use up the entire vial within 6 hours, it's actually considered to be spoiled and they actually have to throw it away. So they do have to plan it pretty well. Another thing to mention is, The vaccine is actually only given to people 16 years and above. So a lot of you here may actually not get it. In Malaysia itself, they have decided to give it to people 18 years and above. And that's just because the vaccine, when they were testing it in the clinical trials, they didn't actually test it in younger kids. But I think that over time, they may add that on to the clinical trials. So hopefully the next time you hear from me or you read about it is that they would have tested it in kids, and it's something that all of you can take as well. Yeah, oh, indeed. But don't worry, I think people are always trying to think of how to best protect everyone. So I would say let's be hopeful about it, and hopefully all of you will be able to take the vaccines. Sometime in the next few months or soon. Right. So yeah, that's okay. That's okay. So Mustard Seed asks, thank you, but fully protected for how long before we need another? Okay. So the question actually can be put up here. Pretty cool. Okay. This is a very good question. Sorry. So at the moment, from what they've seen, is you definitely can have protection for a couple of months. When you talk about vaccines as a whole, kind of going back to the history of vaccines, there are vaccines that can protect you for up to 10 years, some even up to 20 years. So if some of you, I think all of you may have taken BCG before, that actually protects you for a very long time. Things like measles as well, that protects you for a long time as well. Chickenpox is something that protects, chickenpox vaccine is something that protects you for a long time. But there are shorter ones, which is like influenza. So influenza only protects for about 6 months to a year. So at the moment, people don't really know, but they definitely know that it does protect for a couple of months. My expectation is that it will protect for at least a year. So pretty good. If it's something that you only have to take once a year, then that's not too bad actually. Okay, so another interesting question is herd immunity will protect the kids. Yes, correct, Sarah. So we talked about herd immunity later, and this is why it's so important. So imagine if your older sibling, so your mom or your dad, has taken the vaccine, then you're okay as well, because you kind of need about 60 to 70% of people to be protected with the vaccines to make sure that everyone else is safe. So yes, this is where herd immunity comes in and is so important. Another question is very interesting. What should my study path be to become a scientist? Are there different types of scientists? Yes, definitely. So the word scientist itself is so broad. My area falls under biology, but biology itself is really broad. Specifically, I'm a geneticist, so I study the genetic aspect of things, and I do a lot of work in virology, so viruses. So that's kind of my two areas of what type of specific scientist I am. But you could also be a microbiologist. So if you chose to go into microbiology, you would be studying more on bacteria. If you chose to be an immunologist, you would be studying more on like the defense mechanism, like the soldiers. So it's actually really a lot. Kind of just depends on what you want to do. If anyone is interested in kind of hearing more about that, or kind of just talking to me about what you're interested in, I would be happy to tell you, kind of what sort of area you can focus on. But for now, in schools at least, all this is related to biology and a little bit of chemistry. Good question. Mustard Seed asks, why not younger? Just curious. Okay, so in general, whenever they are testing out vaccines, usually what people would do is they would actually omit kids who are much younger. So because the immune system does take a while to develop, so kind of thinking about, if you're comparing, say, a child, a baby, to like even a 5-year-old, the immune system, the soldiers are a bit different. So the older you get, your immune system is a little bit better. In this case, initially when they were studying the trend of COVID and what's the age group that COVID mostly infected, the initial data mostly showed that it was mostly older people who were being infected and not the younger kids. So when they were trying to plan for the clinical trials, they kind of went with that initial data and thought, okay, well, let's just study this in the older people. But now there is newer data that says that younger people can get infected as well. So that's why I do think that they will test it out in younger people soon. Thank you. That's a very good question, Mustard Seed. Strengthening your own antibodies also help. How do we best do that? Okay, thank you, Mustard Seed. So yes, definitely strengthening your own antibodies help. Vaccines are still better, again, kind of because you don't really know how you would respond necessarily, but otherwise kind of just doing your general, eating your vitamin C's or, cod liver oil, kind of those general things, your veggies and stuff, the kind of things that your parents always ask you to do, kind of making sure you get enough sleep, you're not under a lot of stress. All those things actually help as well. You just want to make sure that, yeah, you are kind of strong. And you are protected no matter what. Thank you, Mr. Seed. Good question. Sim asks, can I study this in Malaysia or overseas? You actually can study this in Malaysia. Almost all the universities do offer it, depending on what you want to study. If you are interested in the field of virology or immunology, most of the universities in KL actually offer it. My personal favorite is University Malaya. But again, all the other universities do offer it. Thank you. Good question. All right. So I think we'll move on to the last bit. It's already 11:05. The last bit, which talks about myth in vaccines. Next slide, please. All right. Next slide. Okay, so very quickly, since we're out of time, so these are just some of the common myths. You may have heard this, from your friends or your parents or your neighbors or something, but some people are worried, so they kind of say, I think the vaccine is not safe because, it was created really fast. You just told me that it was done in 1 year as opposed to 15 years. So that's actually not true. As mentioned earlier, this was actually the largest clinical trial ever conducted, and everything actually is checked by so many people. So it actually is really safe. So nothing to worry about. Vaccines are completely okay. The next myth that we often hear is that vaccine effectiveness has never been proven, which is also not true. So even kind of thinking back about ourselves, kind of just thinking back about ourselves, we hear that, we ourselves have taken a lot of vaccines since we were actually a baby. And that's actually why a lot of us are extremely healthy and safe. And we don't really have to worry about, the type of food that we eat and all that, because we are protected really, really well. It's only if you don't take those vaccines that you should be a little worried, because you don't know what you may potentially be exposed to. And the next one is vaccines cause the disease they are meant to prevent. So some people are a little bit worried because if you remember earlier, I spoke a little bit about antigens, and antigens are like a portion of the virus, but the portion of the virus itself is actually not enough to give you an infection. The portion of the virus is just meant to kind of tell the soldiers in your body, hey, look, this is what you should be looking out for. So all this is to say that it actually helps prevent the disease, and it doesn't actually give you the disease. Lastly, and this is something that has been around for a long, long time, is that a lot of people think that vaccines can cause autism. So it's a neurological sort of disorder, and it's not worth the risk. So this is actually not true. This is actually something that people have falsely believed for a long time. Vaccines are good. It does prevent deadly diseases, especially in the time of COVID right now. So again, when it is available to kids, I would highly, highly recommend all of you to take it. All right, that is the last slide. Maybe we can, so take home message. I guess we don't really have to go with that. But yeah, just kind of recap how do vaccines work. Again, you're relying on your body's natural responses. How vaccines develop can take a few years, but in this case, it's amazing. It took 1 year, and how a vaccine's administered through injection in 2 doses, and pretty simple, pretty straightforward, similar to a lot of other vaccines. All right, and last slide. If you do want to contact me, that is my email. I'm always happy to chat about anything, everything. A lot of you are asking about a lot of scientific questions. If you want me to explain a bit more, I'll be happy to do that over email or phone. That's my phone number there. If you do want to pay me a visit one time, maybe after COVID is over, just to kind of see what it's like in a lab. I didn't actually put up any photos of the lab, but yeah, if you kind of want to see what it looks like, kind of what's my daily life like, what type of research, when I say research, what kind of work do I do, you're more than welcome to come visit me. I'm under the Infectious Diseases Unit of the Advanced Medical and Dental Institute of University Science Malaysia. Rina, I think you put your phone number there. Not sure what it's for, but again, feel free to kind of type out a longer message if you had a specific question. I'll take maybe one last round of questions. I had so much fun answering all your questions. Hopefully it inspired you to be a scientist. Any last questions from anyone?
Yeah, so while everyone is thinking about their questions, I've learned so much from your talk. Thank you so much. That was super insightful. That is so much information. There are a lot of good questions here. I think that maybe a lot of people didn't even have a chance to ask all of their questions. So this video actually is going to be put up. It's going to be on YouTube, and I don't know, Kumitaa, how do you feel about maybe doing like an AMA, like ask me anything type of session in the future?
Yeah, I would love doing that because I think it actually has been very inspiring even to me too, kind of just hearing what people have asked, kind of thing, and it kind of gives an idea of how people think about vaccines, what are some of the things people may be worried about. So I absolutely love, doing that. Thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone too. Loved your questions.
Yeah, so if you guys feel like you want to learn more from Dr. Kumitaa, I think we can schedule another session to do that. Dr. Kumitaa said yes. So I think the best way to do this is to follow us on Facebook. We are at We Can Academy. So follow us on Facebook. We will put up some new information if we have plan for a new streaming session to come up. And I really hope that for many of you young students who join us today, that if you want to learn more about what it means to be a scientist, what it means to be in this profession, that you have learned something very useful from Dr. Kumitaa. With that, we just want to thank everyone for your time. Sorry that we run a little bit over, but I think it's been so informative and so helpful. Thank you, everyone. And I will put the link on the Facebook that you can follow us. And don't forget, next week, same time, is session 2, where we're going to have Sarah talk about the logistics. How is the vaccine being moved from one place to another, kept cold, and so on. So make sure to follow us and come back for next week. Okay, Kumitaa, any last words you want to...
There's actually a couple of last minute questions. I don't know, should I take them or...
yeah, maybe we'll address them on the chat later. Would that be good? Okay, all right, great. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.